ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Thank you for joining us for another deck tech. Today we bring you Newton's Cradle, a green-white standard deck that hits fast and hard. Let's take a look at the creatures that we'll be using to lay the smackdown. We have 3 copies of Narnim Renegade, a 1/2 elf warrior for 1 green mana with Death Touch and Revolt. Narnim Renegade enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn. We also have 4 copies of Hope Tender, a 2/2 human druid for 1 generic and 1 green mana. You can pay 1 mana and tap, untap target land, or you can pay 1 mana, tap, and exert Hope Tender, untap 2 target lands. Next, we have 4 copies of Prowling Serpapard, a 4/3 cat snake for 1 generic and 2 green mana. Prowling Serpapard can't be countered, and creature spells you control cannot be countered. And we also have 3 copies of Ronas the Indomitable, a 5/5 legendary creature god for 2 generic and 1 green mana. It has Death Touch and Indestructible. Ronas the Indomitable can't attack or block unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater. It also has pay 2 generic and 1 green mana. Another target creature gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Lastly, we have 3 copies of everyone's favorite green beater, Carnage Tyrant, a 7/6 dinosaur for 4 generic and 2 green mana. Carnage Tyrant cannot be countered, has trample, and hexproof. For non-creature spells, we have 3 copies of Dejuru's Resolve, an instant spell for 1 white mana. Untap target creature, prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn. It also has cycling of 2. This can both protect our key creatures in the deck and untap our exerted Hope Tender if we need it to. We also have 2 copies of Heroic Intervention, an instant spell for 1 generic and 1 green mana. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This can help against board wipes or to protect our board once it is set up. Next, we have 4 copies of Ixalan's Binding, an enchantment for 3 generic and 1 white mana. When Ixalan's Binding enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until Ixalan's Binding leaves the battlefield. Your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. This is mainly to deal with any threats we happen to come across while we're setting up our board, or just to remove blockers when we want to swing in. We also have 4 copies of Growing Rites of Itlimoc, a legendary enchantment for 2 generic and 1 green mana. When Growing Rites of Itlimoc enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 4 more creatures, transform Growing Rites of Itlimoc. And it transforms into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun, a legendary land that you can tap for 1 green mana, or tap and add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each creature you control. When this transforms into the legendary land is when our deck really starts to gain speed. We also have 4 copies of Sram's Expertise, a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 white mana. Create 3 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. This is going to help speed up the transformation of our Growing Rites of Itlimoc, plus it can cast over half of the cards in our deck for us. Lastly, we have 2 copies of Ajani Unyielding, a planeswalker that comes into the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters that cost 4 generic, 1 green, and 1 white mana. His +2 ability is reveal the top 3 cards of your library, put all non-land permanent cards revealed this way into your hand, and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. He has a -2, which is exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power, and its ultimate is a -9. Put 5 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, and 5 loyalty counters on each other planeswalker you control. Now, while his -2 will most always prove more useful than not, we will generally be using him for his +2 ability to gain a bit of card advantage. So ideally, turn 1 we're going to play a Narnum Renegade. This should make your opponent think twice about any kind of early game attacks that they may have planned. Turn 2 we're going to play a Hope Tender. Turn 3 is where this deck explodes. We tap all 3 of our lands we have out. Then we exert our Hope Tender using one of the 3 mana that we have produced and using it to untap 2 of our lands. Make sure that however you do this, 2 white mana are going to be produced and available. With that 4 mana, we can now cast SRAM's Expertise and create 3 1/1 servo tokens. Then we use the second part of SRAM's Expertise to cast Growing Rights of Itlimoc. When we pass the turn, Growing Rights of Itlimoc will transform into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun. Then on turn 4, we will have 9 mana to work with, so we will have no problem getting Carnage Tyrant out of the battlefield, as well as Ronas the Indomitable. On our next turn, Ronas will be online to attack, and our Hope Tender will no longer be exerted and will untap. So, assuming everything is still in place, we can swing in with our Carnage Tyrant, Ronas, and our 1/1 servos. Once blockers are assigned, we can then tap Itlimoc for 7 mana. We then use one of those mana to activate our Hope Tender, targeting Itlimoc. We can then tap Itlimoc again and, with our 5 land, produce a final total of 18 mana, which we can use to activate Ronas' ability of giving another target creature +2/+0 and trample a total of 6 times. That's a total of 27 damage coming across on this turn, all but 5 of it from Ronas being trample damage. Our land base consists of 2 copies of Endless Sands, a desert that can tap 1 to produce a generic mana. You can pay 2, tap it, exile target creature you control, or pay 4, tap it, sacrifice Endless Sands, return each creature card exiled with Endless Sands to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is kind of a life raft for our creatures should we see some spot removal or board wipes, so we can bring them back to restart our beatdown a little bit later on. We also have 2 copies of Field of Ruin that can tap and add 1 generic mana to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 mana, tap it, and sacrifice Field of Ruin, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches his or her library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, then shuffles his or her library. While we can use this to simply interrupt our opponent's mana production should they be using non-basics, its main purpose is to deal with any other decks that are also running Growing Rights of Itlimoc, or any other cards that happen to transform into lands that we have in Standard right now. We also have 4 copies of Sunpetal Grove. Sunpetal Grove enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or a plains, and we can tap it to add either 1 green or 1 white mana to our mana pool. We also have 8 copies each of both forests and plains. Our sideboard consists of 4 copies of Demystify, an instant spell for 1 white mana that destroys target enchantment. This is for any enchantment-heavy decks or for any deck that happens to be running Cast Out or Ixalan's Binding. We also have 2 copies of Fumigate, a sorcery spell for 3 generic and 2 white mana. Destroy all creatures. You gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. This is going to help us with those token decks that like to go wide early on. We also have 3 copies of Settle the Wreckage, an instant spell for 2 generic and 2 white mana. Exile all attacking creature target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic land cards, put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle his or her library. This serves the same purpose as Fumigate, but can dodge decks running Heroic Intervention or the like. We also have 4 copies of Solemnity, an enchantment for 2 generic and 1 white mana. Players can't get counters, and counters cannot be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. This will greatly slow down, if not outright stop, most counter and energy decks. And lastly, we have 2 copies of Sandworm Convergence, an enchantment for 6 generic and 2 green mana. Creatures with flying can't attack you or a planeswalker you control, And at the beginning of your end step, create a 5/5 green worm creature token. This is for those decks that try to grind us out, or any decks that happen to have a lot of flyers. All in all, this is a competitive deck that delivers in the fun, as well as a severe beating to your opponents. If you decide to play this deck, let us know how you did down in the comments. If you didn't play this deck, but you still have some thoughts on it, we'd love to hear that too. I want to thank all of you for joining us in this deck tech today. If you liked what you saw, click that like button, hit subscribe, and share to your heart's content. Share it with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, ChuckWagon MTG. And if you do me one last little favor, check out this message from our sponsor. ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. They have 3 different locations, and they run Magic events every Monday through Saturday, and their Friday Night Magic consists of Standard, Modern, and Legacy every week. This is why I've personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.